Unfaithful is he. He, the great example, is and pattern for me. Where he leads, I follow. Follow all the way. Where he leads, I follow. Follow Jesus every day. List to his loving words, come unto me. Weary, heavy laden, there is sweet rest for thee. Trust in his promises, faithful and sure. Lean upon the Savior, and thy soul is secure. Where he leads, I follow. Follow all his way. Where he leads, I follow. Follow Jesus every day. Our hymn of invitation, I have decided to follow Jesus, number 272. 272.
How do you tell when food in your refrigerator is going bad? I spent the night, or a couple of days, years ago. I was in Scotland, and then I stayed with an American missionary family, and his tradition every evening was to have a bowl of cereal before he went to bed. And there was a time or two, because I can never remember. We pasteurize and homogenize milk, and over there they do one and not the other, and I forget which it is, so it doesn't last as long. And occasionally he would go to pour the milk into a cereal, mix it up, take a because it had gone bad and he didn't notice it. And occasionally Debbie will hand me a bottle or jug of milk. No, that's not good. Usually it's the smell. And we got to digging in the refrigerator once. This was years ago at Debbie's parents. It was smelling bad. We couldn't figure out where it was. Finally, her dad thought to pull it out from the wall. We took the back off. A mouse had crawled inside and gotten electrocuted and died, and that was the smell. Now, you can tell when things are getting bad food-wise. Hopefully, they will never get this bad that you've got to put on a hazmat suit, but they do get bad. And in fact, here's a test you can tell when some things are going bad. For instance, if you can take chip dip out of its container and bounce it on the floor, it's gone bad. If canned goods have become the size and or shape of a softball, dispose of them carefully. Milk is spoiled when it starts to look like yogurt. Yogurt is spoiled when it starts to look like cottage cheese. Cottage cheese is spoiled when it starts to look like regular cheese. And cheddar cheese is spoiled when you think rather it is blue cheese, but you realize you've never bought blue cheese. And when you find spoiled food, what's the sensible thing to do with it? Out with it. But what do you do when you've got spoiled family? All right, grandparents, y'all be quiet right now. You know, to a point, grandparents are supposed to spoil the kids and send them home to mom and dad because, you know, that's why grandparents and grandkids get along so well. They've got a common enemy in the middle. But what do you do when it's your own kids? We're going to look at one situation. Eli, if you'll turn to 1 Samuel chapter 2. As we look at this biography of Eli and his sons and what happened with them. Now, Jerusalem at this time is not Israeli territory. That doesn't happen for about another 80 or 90 years when King David is on the scene. So the tabernacle is here in Shiloh. I've got the arrow kind of pointing to it. Jerusalem and Bethlehem are down here. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. Here's the Dead Sea. And up here would be modern Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and come on down into Egypt down here. Now that's basically the geography of it. Now, if you're in 1 Samuel, look at chapter 2, verse 12. Notice it says that Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. They were what today we might call the stereotypical preacher's kid. And I have known some preacher's kid who fit that stereotype. They were the worst behaved kids in the class. I remember when I was about 9th grade, a kid, his name was Tony, and we were talking, I can't even remember now if it was something about going to a dance or something, and he said he'd basically have to lie to his parents And I said something to him about, oh, they don't like you going to dances. And he just glared at me and said, my dad's a preacher. And I had another friend in that same class. Her dad was a preacher. Now, she wasn't as bad as Tony, but she smoked and did a lot of other things that I don't think any preachers would want their kids to. At least I wouldn't. On the other hand, I've known some preachers' kids that were quite good and themselves grew up to become preachers. But this is a case here where the preacher's kids, the prophet's kids, the priest's kids are the worst behaved kids in the classroom. Let's have a look at the fruit here, first of all. Now, we all know good fruit from bad fruit. We can take a look at this and tell which is the better apple and which is not the better apple. And Jesus, in fact, said, you will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? And I've got peaches here. That's peach season. I happen to like peaches better than figs. Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. Now, I have learned at times there are certain places I like to buy my produce and places I don't, or my meat, or whatever the grocery items, because certain stores you'll learn sometimes have got better selection. And then he goes on to say, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. Now, Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they're rotten fruit. They are rotten kids. And from the looks of it, we can tell they are probably spoiled because of the corruption and the bad fruit produced in their lives. And this is why it is very critical for us to make sure that we do produce good fruit, that we set a good example for our kids, for our community. You know, we can do all the preaching we want. We're going to start a study here of Muscle and Shovel next week. We can do all that we want. We can learn every conceivable method of presenting the gospel. But if we're producing bad fruit in our lives, we're going to fail. It's not going to work. We've got to be producing some decent fruit. And they weren't. Now, one of the things I noticed, I don't know if y'all ever noticed this in reading about Eli, you know what's missing from this? Anybody? Where's their mother? I don't read about a mother in there. Did I miss it? So he's raising these boys as a single parent. Parenting has always been tough. Going all the way back to Cain and Abel. I mean, there was the ultimate case of sibling rivalry when you kill your sibling. And here we've got Eli. It looks like he's raising them as a single parent. We don't read about a mother anywhere. So who knows? I'm assuming she probably died somewhere early on. And so he's raising them up and trying to do what he can do. But we can see he gets a little too passive in trying to raise these boys because they are guilty of some pretty bad sins against the Lord. In fact, if you look at verse 13, if you're in 1 Samuel chapter 2, the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a three-pronged flesh hook in his hand while the meat was cooking. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did it in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. This is how the priests got how they ate. This would be like, in modern times, this would be like maybe you going and buying us supper every day or lunch or bringing us a meal. That would be roughly the best way I could think of, since we don't have a lot of farms and we don't offer sacrifices anymore. That would be the best thing I can think of for a modern day equivalent. That's how they ate. And also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servant would come and say to the men who sacrificed, "Give meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw." So they're picky too. And if the man said to him, "They should really burn the fat first, then you may take as much as your heart desires," he would then answer for him, "No, but you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force." Therefore, the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men had abhorred the offering of the Lord. So here's the preacher's kid. This would be probably more like, as you're giving your offering, you've got, you got some big mafia type dude standing there as you're putting your money in the plate saying, "Hey, you put a 50 and you got 100 sitting there. You need to put that in." "Hey, but I got to buy groceries." "Yeah, but you need to put that in." You see, that's the kind of thing they're doing. They're taking this from the people. They're taking more than what they should be taking. So it's incredibly corrupt. Kind of like some of our televangelists and people like that today. Very corrupt. And then if you look on down to verse 22, Eli's getting old, and he hears what his sons are doing. And it says there that they even lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Because of his age, his sons are also adults, and they're having sex in the building. Imagine walking into the church building today and catching a couple having sex. How many of us would stand for that? How many of us would think, hey, that's just modern times? No, that is not good. That is wrong. That is sin. And that's what's happening here. These boys were not good guys. One writer said they forced themselves upon the meat of the temple, the ladies of the temple, the goodwill of the worshipers, and God's people were being abused. God's place was desecrated, and God's provision were stolen. And God is so upset with them, he sends a prophet to Eli to take action. Look at verse 23. Where Eli, we can see, did not take any action. All he did was go to him and say, hey boys, guys, why are you doing this? I hear from the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, it's not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. So he's going to them, hey guys, look, you really got to stop. I'm getting all these bad reports. And that's as far as he's taking it. He is not laying down the law. He's not putting the hammer down. Think of whatever expression you want. He's not doing it. He's being very passive in how his boys are behaving here. And then if you go and look and see the difference that his words are making here, which is essentially nothing. Because look at verse 25. His sons did not listen to the father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. In other words, God has pretty well decided, here's what I'm going to do. I've had enough. Could Eli have done anything to change his son's destiny? At this point, I don't think so. Earlier in the game, maybe. I don't know what God's mind was, but it was pretty well made up. God had just had enough. There was a story I read while I was preparing this about an Amish man caught his boys drinking beer in a local tavern. He went into them there at the tavern, and he said to them, well, boys, he said, I'm going to take the horses home. You two can take the buggy home. He did something. Didn't want them hurting the horses, so he left them with the buggy. They had to drag that thing home. And those things, they look light, but I've had to move a few of them. They're not that light. He did something to deal with it, something to get their attention. But Eli, you notice, didn't do anything to stop his boys from their behavior. He just kind of gave them what looks to me like a polite talking to. It wasn't even a, here, sit down, we need to talk. It looks to me like he was almost apologetic. That's the way I take it. God tells us, though, that if we want what's best for our children, when they get rebellious and disobedient, we need to do more than just talk. Discipline your sons, we're told, in that there is hope, but do not be a willing party to his death in Proverbs chapter 19. See, we're also told to discipline our children. Now remember, discipline and punishment are not the same. Discipline is teaching. It's training. I think something broke down here in Hophni and Phinehas' upbringing, that they were not trained properly. There was a story I read about a leader, a deacon in a church who was having an affair, and they decided to remove him. The problem was he had a cousin who was an elder. They did it while his elder cousin was out of town. But when he returned from his vacation, he wasn't happy at all about it and began rallying people to his cousin's defense, and eventually reinstated him as a deacon. See, and as time went on, it became known that one of the worst kept secrets in town was the adultery that this deacon committed. So they didn't do him any favors by letting him serve as a deacon, especially when his cousin, who was kind of considered by some to be the leading elder in the church, got behind his cousin. You see, he needed to repent. He needed to change his life, and he never did. And because Eli never seemed to get the hang of disciplining his kids, he eventually became a willing party in them. And I'm going to get to that in just a minute, because it sure looks like Eli set a bad example. A lack of discipline in his sons was a problem, but I think Eli himself had a discipline problem. Let's look on here a little bit, and starting in verse 16, that it is possible that Eli himself had a self-discipline problem. When we're told the outcome of a particular battle, and a man came and said to Eli, I am he who came from the battle, and I fled today from the battle line. And he said, what happened, my son? So the messenger answered and said, Israel has fled before the Philistines. There has been a great slaughter among the people. Also your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. Now watch this. Then it happened when he made mention of the ark of God that Eli fell off the seat backward by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For the man was old and heavy, and he had judged Israel for 40 years. I wonder why it was recorded, the fact that he was not only old, but he was heavy. I wonder if he might have had a self-discipline problem, and he was glutton and a compulsive overeater. Remember, his sons, if we went back to chapter 2, were taking food that they had no business taking from the sacrifices. They were taking extra large portions from the people coming to offer sacrifices. He knew his sons were robbing the sacrifices. Eli, it says, was fat, and it's possibly because he'd been sharing in the stolen food of that his boys had. He may not have realized just how brazen they'd gotten, but he knew enough, and he partook enough of their sin. See, and it can get to be hard to rebuke. This is an artist's rendition of him. You notice the boys, one of them here has got what looks like a lamb's leg, not lamb, but a cow's leg or something. Here's one fooling around the woman. Here's Eli, trying to figure out what to do. It gets to be hard to rebuke our kids when we're not able or willing and able to confront our own sins and our own shortcomings. Parents can only give good advice or put them on the right paths, but the final forming of a person's character lies in their own hand. That's a quote attributed to Anne Frank. Now, it's hard to confront kids about drinking and using drugs if you've got a beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other while you're talking to them. Now, I need to draw a line here or make a distinction here, because I've known some parents who didn't want to go and talk to their kids about, say, premarital sex or drugs because, well, when I was in school, I toked a little marijuana and I fooled around a bit. So I'd be a hypocrite if I told my kids not to. Let me answer that real quick and to take care of that. No, you're not. In that setting, no, you're not a hypocrite. What you are is someone who, you sinned, made mistakes, however you want to phrase it, but you've learned your lesson and you don't want your kids to take the same path you took. That's not a hypocrite. That's just being a concerned parent. That's just doing, if you put it this way, that's just doing your job as a parent, is trying to keep your kids out of trouble. Now, if you're standing there telling the kids that they shouldn't be drinking, you don't want them involved in drugs, and you're, cigarette in one hand, beer in the other, now we can talk about hypocrite. When you're telling your kids to be honest, never lie, always tell the truth, and this is before cell phones, but how many of you did this? Phone rings and dad or mom says, if that's so-and-so, I'm not here. Or maybe just, hey, I'm not here. But then what happens when your son comes in late or your daughter comes in late and you ask them where they were and you find out they lied? How many parents would have been happy with that? See, for some reason, we seem to think it's okay for us to lie, but when we get lied to, for some reason, we don't like it much, do we? But that's the kind of thing that we have to think about. That's the kind of thing we need to think about. How are you going to expect your kids to grow up and be nice, level-headed people if you're one who keeps losing your temper all the time? How are you going to want them to control their temper and their mouth if you don't control yours? Now, we have to remember, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. I know that. You know that. All have sinned. The problem, though, doesn't lie in the fact that we have sinned. The problem lies in the fact that we don't always confront our sins. Remember, Proverbs said, he who covers his sins will not prosper, but whoever confesses them and forsakes them will have mercy. See, the best way to disarm a destructive nature and our own shortcomings is to own up to the fact that we're wrong. Own up to the fact that, yeah, I sinned. I screwed up. I messed up. I shouldn't have done that. But Eli, as far as we can tell, never did that. Eli, so far as we can tell, never admitted his error. He didn't forsake his own sins. This would be like maybe the preacher coming forward and confessing sin. I've heard of two instances where 2 elders that I know of, and only one preacher that I can think of off the top of my head, have actually gone before a congregation and confessed sin. And only one or two times that a preacher or an elder has come up and asked the church to pray for him because of whatever their struggles they were dealing with. Doesn't happen a whole lot because many times we're afraid to admit weakness. We're afraid to admit that we have to struggle just like everybody else does. But remember, we're in good company because we're told that Elijah was a man just like us. David was a man after God's own heart, but look what he did. And then look at chapter 2, verse 29. God finally sends a prophet to Eli. And the prophet comes with a question. Why do you honor your sons more than me? Why are you honoring and putting your sons ahead of God? Now, as a parent, I love my daughter, I love my wife, love my family, but I've got to keep my priorities right. God has got to be the number one priority. I cannot forsake disciplining and raising my child up because I think she's more important than the Lord, or like Eli did here, that I want her to get away with things. I cannot make excuses about why I am the way I am and then expect my daughter to grow up to be a Christian and to serve the Lord. And that's what Eli's having to contend with here. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus said, anyone who loves his father or mother more than him is not worthy of him. He is not telling us not to love our family. He is not, I believe it's Luke's account where he says that anyone who comes to me must hate his mother and father. What he's talking about is priorities. I have to love my family less than I love the Lord. And we have to, in 1 John chapter 3, how great is the love of the Father. Behold, what manner of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called the sons of God. See, we are setting an example for our kids. We've got to make sure that we show them that God is our priority, yes, but we have to also discipline them, unlike Eli did. His biggest problem was that he loved his kids so much that he put them ahead of the Lord and wouldn't teach them the ways of the Lord properly. And I'm in some groups on Facebook that there's a couple of them that are creation versus evolution, atheists versus theists, and I mostly watch what goes on in there. But I've had a couple people, and I see a post occasionally where a parent will say, and I've even heard some Christians say this, well, I don't want to force my beliefs on my kid. I want my kid to grow up and make up his own mind. Well, there's something I learned a long time ago. It's pretty simple. Your kid's going to make up his own mind anyway. I was not raised in a religious church growing home. But when it came time and I got presented with the gospel, I made up my own mind. Your kids are going to make up their mind. You've got 6 or 8 hours a day in the schools where they are teaching them atheistic evolution. They're teaching them left-wing political agendas, left-wing versions of history. They're teaching them to have no respect for God. They've got television shows and movies that they're watching that show people just having sex indiscriminately. They show people married and having kids and all things without being married. So do you think for a minute that any of that is going to encourage or influence your kid to become a Christian? Well, I can answer that one for you too. No. So as parents, we need to influence. I want my child to grow up and be a Christian. I need to be influencing her. I need to be reading the Bible to her, praying with her, and setting an example for her. And for all the other young people that are here in this congregation. Because the world is not going to help them become Christians. It's going to be up to us to do it. It's going to be up to us to influence our children and put our beliefs into them. There is a wrong way to tell your children about it. I have known people who are faithful Christians and none of their kids are Christians. In fact, I know a congregation where pretty much what I would call from baby boomers up to the late term, they would now be probably about 40 to about 60 years old. They've lost that entire generation. They quit going pretty much as soon as they hit the adult years. It was at one time a 300-member church. It's now about the size we are. Some of those people are going to other churches. Some of them aren't going. Most of them aren't going anywhere. I don't know why in every single case, but I do know in a few cases why it is. Because we're told to raise up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he won't depart from it. I sort of add a little corollary to that says there's a right way and a wrong way. I've known parents who did shove it down their kids' throats, who did force them, not in a spirit of love, but more in a spirit of like a drill sergeant to be at church and be in all the activities. When they grew up, they were out of there. And also there were church problems that caused kids to go away from the Lord. So we have to remember that. Remember that we should not be fussing and fighting because it is going to make an influence on the young people. Remember that that our example will either lead them to Christ or drive them away. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, God instructs his people that I give you these commandments today to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit in the house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Tell your children about Jesus. When you get up, do you talk to them about sports more, or do you talk to them about Jesus? Maybe you were like this one writer that I found, that he said he had a drug problem when he was a young person. I was drugged to church on Sunday morning and Sunday night. I was drugged to church on Wednesday night. I was drugged to Sunday school every week. I was drugged to vacation Bible school. I was drugged to the family altar to read the Bible and to pray. See, when we look at this and we see how people have been brought to the Lord and get them into those habits, we'll have a better chance of them becoming Christians. This same writer went on to say, I was also drugged to the woodshed when I disobeyed my parents, when I told a lie, when I brought home a bad report card or did not speak with respect or spoke ill of the teacher or of the preacher. Those drugs are still in my veins and they affect my behavior and everything I do and say and think. They are stronger than cocaine, crack, or heroin. If our children had this drug problem, America would certainly be a better place. See, whenever you put your children in sports and leisure activities or whatever ahead of their need to see God in their lives, that's when we ultimately are going to hurt them. Sure, get them into sports, get them into various clubs and activities, but remember, those do not get them to heaven. It is going to be their fellowship with Christians and ultimately obeying the gospel. When you look at Eli's failure to raise his boys properly, and look at that and compare it to another family that was kind of contemporary, Hannah. She came in, she was barren, she had no children, she really wanted a child, she pled to God for a child, and eventually she was able to conceive and bear a child. And of course her son became Samuel, the one who this book is named for that we're studying out of. And because of he became one of the greatest prophets and leaders that Israel had in the Old Testament. Eli's sons lost everything because of the wrath of God. Hannah's boy, though, changed a nation and received the blessings of God. So are we raising Hophnis and Phinehas's, or are we raising Samuels? I hope we're going to turn out some Samuels. We need more Samuels. We need to be setting a good example for the young people, and you can define young however you want. We all need to set a good example for everybody. For our friends who aren't Christians, regardless of their age, for our neighbors who aren't Christians. Set a good example so that they will want one day to know what it is we have, to know about becoming a Christian. So this afternoon, if we can help you to own up to whatever shortcomings you may have, unlike Eli did, so that you can go in a different direction. Why not let us know as together we stand and as we sing?
A happy sight.